بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على أشرف الأنبياء سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله تعالى به: ثم يجب له تعالى 7 صفات تسمى صفات المعاني، وهي القدرة والإرادة المتعلقان بجميع الممكنات، والعلم المتعلق بجميع الواجبات والجائزات والمستحيلات، والحياة وهي لا تتعلق بشيء، والسمع والبصر المتعلقان بجميع الموجودات، والكلام الذي ليس بحرف ولا صوت ويتعلق بما يتعلق به العلم من المتعلقات. ثم 7 يجب له تعالى تسمى صفات معنوية، وهي ملازمة للسبع الأولى، وهي كونه تعالى قادرا ومريدا وعالما وحيا وسميعا وبصيرا ومتكلما. After covering the first 6 attributes, which were al-wujud, al-qidam, al-baqa, mukhalafatuhu ta'ala lil-hawadith, wa qiyamuhu ta'ala bi nafsihi, and al-wahdaniyya. These 6, the first one was called nafsiyya, and the second 5, group of 5, were called salbiyya. The first one related to the self, and the second 5 related to negating the opposite. And the distinction drawn between these 5 and the 7 attributes which are coming, al-qudra, al-ilmu, al-hayatu, al-sam'u, al-basaru, al-kalamu, is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removed the veils from our eyes, we would be able to see the 7 attributes. The 7 attributes which the author mentions now. These 7 attributes are called Sifat Al-Ma'ani. The word Al-Ma'ani is plural of Ma'na. Whenever they describe something as being Sifatul Ma'na, this would mean a description of something. For instance, if you have an object and the color of the object is white or black, that description of the object would be described as Sifatul Ma'na. The attribute of that object would be described as Sifatul Ma'na. Walillahi al-mathalul a'la. When we talk regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we mean the divine attributes. Of course, there's no comparison between an object and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because last week we covered the attribute mukhalafatuhu lil hawadith, his opposition to contingent things. And this would mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bears no similarity to contingent things. But sifatul ma'na is an attribute of something. So when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we discuss the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sifatul Ma'ani are those attributes which are qualitative, meaning we describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as having those attributes, like al-ilm, knowledge, al-qudra, divine power, al-kalamu, divine speech. These are attributes which we ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore they are called Sifatul Ma'ani. Sifat, plural of sifa, al-ma'ani, plural of al-ma'na. So he states, ثُمَّ يَجِبُ لَهُ تَعَالَى, then it is essential for him, the Most High Ta'ala, 7 sifatin, 7 attributes, 7 divine attributes, تُسَمَّى صِفَاتِ الْمَعَانِ, that are named the qualitative attributes, Sifat Al-Ma'ani, or the attributes of meaning, the attributes that carry a meaning. وَهِيَ And the first attribute he mentions, al-qudratu wal-iradatu, divine power and divine will. These are the first two attributes he mentions. Now last week, a question was posed. What is the difference between hellfire being eternal and the divine attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being eternal? I am sure by now you will be able to answer this question. How do we answer this question? By saying that hellfire is contingent. What do we mean by contingent? That it started at one point. We know the famous hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created hellfire, and hellfire was, the color of hellfire was red. Then the fire was burnt for another 1,000 years until it became white. And then it was burnt until it became black. Meaning hellfire had a starting point. Anything which has a starting point or is possible, which falls under mumkin, jaiz, anything which has a starting point is contingent, hadith or possible, and therefore can finish. But what keeps hellfire as being eternal? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustains hellfire. So when we say hellfire and paradise are eternal, this is eternal in the contingent sense, that they are dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to exist. And also these two creations are contingent in their nature. People reside in hellfire, will reside in hellfire, people will reside in paradise. But both of these are contingent in their nature and dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember, the eternality, the eternal nature of hellfire is from the creed of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But when we say eternal, meaning sustainability, continuous sustaining of hellfire forever by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Imam As-Subki rahmallahu ta'ala wrote Ad-Durratul Mudi'a fi Raddi ala Ibn Taymiyyah, which was a book in refutation of Ibn Taymiyyah on the extinguishing of hellfire, because this position was ascribed to him, and Al-Imam As-Subki rahimahullah ta'ala refuted the position and refrained from anathematizing, declaring him a disbeliever because of some doubts regarding the ascription or whatever detail is mentioned in that particular work. But the position of hellfire being sustained forever is from one of the essential beliefs of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But when we say hellfire is eternal, some atheists or people who have a simplistic understanding of theology will understand that we are comparing or making analogy between the divine attributes and the contingent nature of hellfire, when there is a distinction between the two. A second question was regarding the point I mentioned, that for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there is no opposite. What do we mean by saying there is no opposite for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is meant by this is that opposite, the very definition of opposite as given by the theologians is الضدان قد يجتمعان في شيء وقد يرتفعان عنه, which means two opposites sometimes may be found in something and sometimes not be found in anything. For instance, black and white. You can have a thing which is black and white, and sometimes you can have a thing which is red, neither black or white. This is the definition of an opposite. Opposites are similar in nature. Do not mix this with an-naqid. An-naqid is something which is totally distinct. Totally distinct. An-naqidan لا يجتمعان في شيء ولا يرتفعان عنه, which means two things which are totally distinct. You do not find one thing with the other thing. For instance, existence and non-existence. Either something exists or does not exist. And you cannot remove both things from that one thing. For instance, you cannot have something not existing and existing at the same time. It will either exist or it will not exist. So when we say there is no opposite for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is in reality negation of anything bearing resemblance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that clear? Because you asked the question, is that the answer clear? If you have any more need of clarity, you can send the question forward. So here the divine attributes here, al-qudratu wal-iradatu, divine power and divine will. The author rahimahullah states, al-muta'alliqani bi jami'il mumkinati. These two attributes, divine power and divine will, are attached to all possibilities. If you remember in a previous session, someone asked, would it be possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create another creator, God? And we said this would relate to the attribute of divine will and divine power. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not will the impossible, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His qudra, His divine power does not relate to the impossible. So in effect, the existence of another creator would be impossible. This is why the author mentioned bi jami'il mumkinat, with all possible things, that the divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only associate themselves with mumkinat, possibilities, not impossibilities. A story, a narration ascribed to Sayyiduna Idris alayhi salam is that he was sewing with a needle and the shaitan approached him and said, the shaitan had an egg, and he said, is it possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to place the entire universe inside of the shell of this egg? And Sayyiduna Idris alayhi salam, in what is reported or ascribed to him, said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to place the entire universe in the hole, fi summil khayat, which is the hole of the needle. Based on this, scholars like Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and other scholars, theologians, extracted judgments regarding the divine attributes of Allah, the divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is mentioned in the story is that Sayyiduna Idris alayhi salam poked the eye of Satan, and made him cross-eyed. Some scholars comment on this and say it would have been more appropriate for him to, someone may object, because you cannot correct a prophet in his actions. They say someone may object that it would have been appropriate for him to have cut off his tongue. But they answered this. They answered the objection by saying, Sayyiduna Idris alayhi salam made him cross-eyed because shaitan's basira, which is spiritual sight, as basar is to the eyesight, basira is to the heart. Basar meaning physical eyesight, basira meaning inward eyesight, inward sight. So he said, they say in response that because he was missing basira, spiritual insight, Sayyiduna Idris alayhi salam showed this on his eyes by making him cross-eyed. But what is the meaning of this story? The meaning of the story is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do all things which are possible. And the meaning of this would be that the eggshell would either be transformed large enough to contain the universe, or the universe would be made small enough to be contained in the eggshell. And this is not impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So by saying bi jami' al-mumkinat, the author is referring to all possibilities. We'll continue after Azan, inshallah. So what we were mentioning was that the divine power and divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only associated with possibilities. People who did not understand this basic premise made faulty analogies. For example, Ibn Hazm, in his book Al-Milal wal-Nihal, he mentions the possibility of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having a child. And he is refuted by Al-Imam Sanusi rahimahullah in Sharh Sughra, the commentary on this text, where he mentions the faulty premise of Ibn Hazm, that it would be impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have a child. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not, His divine will does not attach itself to impossibilities. Now the divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses everything from possible, impossible and necessary. The divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The divine will is only associated with possibilities, and the divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only associated with possibilities. What would be the difference between the divine power and divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The difference would be that divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sifatul inkishaf. It uncovers ma'lumat, known things. But we would not say it is sifa mu'athira, an effecting attribute. So for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows we will do something. He knowing that we will do something, does it mean He has forced us to do something? No. Because the attribute is not mu'athira, effecting. The sifatul irada, divine will, is associated with mumkinat, possibilities. And sifatul qudra, divine attribute of divine power, is associated with effectuating, bringing about things which are possible. So you will see the effect of the qudra, divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We would be able to observe the effect of the divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the distinction between these three attributes. This is why the author states, Al-Qudratu wal-Iradatu, divine power and divine will, Al-Muta'alliqani bi jami' al-mumkinati, which are attached to all possibilities. But with regard to divine knowledge, the author states, وَالْعِلْمُ الْمُتَعَلِّقُ بِجَمِيعِ الْوَاجِبَاتِ وَالْجَائِزَاتِ وَالْمُسْتَحِيلَاتِ, which means divine knowledge is attached to all essential things, al-wajibat, wal-jaizat, permissible things, wal-mustahilat, impossible things. So first we understand that the divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the divine knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses necessary things, impossible things and possible things. The divine will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His divine will only will those things which are possible. And the divine power, al-qudra, will only effectuate or bring into existence those things which are possible. This is why the reasoning of Ibn Hazm is faulty in his book Al-Milal wal-Nihal. And in the same way, anyone who would say the divine power associates, or the divine will wills for the existence of impossibilities or deficiencies or faulty things. This is something which must be understood. The author states, وَالْحَيَاةُ وَهِيَ لَا تَتَعَلَّقُ بِشَيْءٍ. From this passage, inshallah, we will continue next week after the Isha prayer. So next week, Isha is at 8:15. Straight after the Isha prayer, we will start the dars, the lesson, inshallah.